Okay, thanks, Tim. So can you see my screen there okay?
Yes, we can see it fine.
Okay, that's great. My name is Ian Short. I work for Chagos, which is the Agriculture and Food Development Authority in Ireland. I'm part of the Forestry Development Department, and I work as a researcher, particularly on broadleaf silviculture, but also alternative silviculture systems. I have a primary degree from Bangor in agroforestry, BSc agroforestry, and then I also did my master's and my PhDs in agroforestry as well. And it's great, so just over 20 years after graduating from Bangor, to see agroforestry really kind of progressing and beginning to progress here in Ireland. So my presentation anyway this evening, it's about agroforestry and integrating trees with agriculture, and it's an update from Ireland. So just to go through a bit of the content, be looking at the context of agroforestry. What is agroforestry exactly? And then some agroforestry in Europe, and then how that feeds into agroforestry in Ireland. So in the context, Ireland obviously is part of the EU, and the EU has published a forest strategy for 2030. And within this forest strategy, the member states are being encouraged to accelerate the rollout of carbon farming practices. And they also, for instance, are using the eco schemes on agroforestry within this. In addition to that, there's also the EU 3 billion tree planting pledge, and this is a pledge for the EU as a whole to plant 3 billion extra trees in addition to business as usual. And this is not only to expand existing forests, but it's also focusing on agroforestry and trees in agricultural landscapes. So it has quite good connotations there for us thinking about agroforestry. Now, in Ireland, just to give a bit of context for Ireland, Ireland has the lowest forest cover in the year. It's 11%, just over 11%. And you maybe can see there on that graph on the left-hand side, the little red line is the forest cover, and the green line is the increase in proportion of forest area. So you can see that Ireland's forest cover has increased dramatically over the last 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, because the state has a very strong expansionist policy. And that expansionist policy has been really to plant plantations on private land, i.e. farmers' land. And it's only in the last number of years that agroforestry has started up really. Another context which is important is that Ireland has 58% grassland cover, which is the highest proportion in the EU. And the next highest is there, you might be able to see the Netherlands, which is just over 30%, 34%. So Ireland has a relatively treeless but very pasture-based landscape. Ireland has the third largest bovine herd in the EU, and this is for a relatively small country. So you can kind of see where the land use pattern is here. And we also have the 5th largest EU sheep flock. So it kind of makes sense that we're looking now at agroforestry, and particularly silver pasture, as a form of land use to be able to get more trees into the ground. And under that context, we've also got climate change and emissions and all that stuff as well. So we're committed to reducing greenhouse gases by 51% by the year 2030. And this is including agroforestry as a mitigation option. Also, there's initiatives such as agroforestry to encourage diversification of different types of forestry systems. So agroforestry in the last year or two has really started making inroads into government policies and strategies where previously it wouldn't have been seen. So I think that's great progress. Now, this is a question that that I would be asked sometimes is, what is agroforestry? And if we go to a definition, now this is the FAO definition from the UN, and I'm not going to read this out. I don't expect you to read it yourselves. It's a bit too much. And the same with the EU definition. I think that the European Commission's definition, whilst it's much shorter, if you try and remember that and say that to somebody, you kind of lost them. So a definition that I tend to use with landowners is that agroforestry is growing trees on farms, but in particular, where those trees have an interaction with the agricultural enterprise. And then the agroforestry itself is split up into silvorarbor, silvopastoral, and agri-silvopastoral. And that depends on whether there's the crops, the livestock, together with the trees. But I'm sure all of us here on this webinar are already familiar with this. And the interactions themselves, there can be various and many interactions, both positive and negative. And obviously we want to promote and progress the positive interactions and try and mitigate and manage the negative interactions. So if you introduce a tree into an agricultural field, there are various interactions that can happen, various ways that those trees can both positively and negatively impact microclimate, soil, nutrients, water, temperature, all sorts of things. So when talking with landowners about introducing trees, this is one aspect that really needs to be impressed upon them. And also, a lot of the time, I think farmers are very aware of the interactions of trees on agriculture. It's just they've never really thought about it before, but it's there in the background. You know, they know about shelter, they know about nutrients and all the rest of it. And it's just getting that out of them, but also trying to impress upon them and get them to remember that themselves. So those interactions can be managed various ways. And the first way, I suppose, of managing those interactions is by the location of the trees, where the trees are planted. So the trees could be planted either within the field in lines, say like a agro-silvorarbor system with alleys, or along contours to help maybe control water runoff from slopes. It could be planted as boundaries, so it could be maybe hedgerows, shelter belts, windbreaks, those kind of things. They could be scattered within a field. Now, either may be scattered throughout the field, or perhaps there might be groups in the headlands and the corners, perhaps, or maybe they're scattered throughout a field in a uniform manner. So a few different examples here. So in the top left is a silvorarbor system. This is in County Kildare, and it's a horticulture system, and they planted willow, and they're harvesting the willow and taking that as coppice for biomass. And they have seen, and anecdotally, the shelter, the benefit of shelter in this relatively exposed site. And so this was planted without any grant schemes or anything. They did this themselves. In the top middle there, obviously, is a silvopastoral system. Top right is chickens grazing within an orchard. Bottom right, another silvopastoral system. This is actually up in Loch Gall with the sheep, and the ash planted at 5 by 5 meter spacing. Bottom middle is a riparian system. So this is along a boundary of a field to help protect watercourses. And then bottom left, the two images from the bottom left are the Dehesa system from Spain, which is an agri-silvopastoral system. So just talking about Europe, agroforestry in Europe, the Ag Forward project, which was an EU project that I personally wasn't involved in, but I'm sure one or two people on this webinar were. They used satellite and remote sensing imagery to categorize land uses within Europe, and they came out with a figure of 15.4 million hectares of agroforestry in Europe, which equated to about 9% of the utilizable agricultural area. And 15.1 million hectares of that agroforestry with silvopastoral systems. And in the map there, the map is from EURAF, which is the European Agroforestry Federation, of which the Farm Woodland Forum is a member and the Irish Agroforestry Forum are members. And that map is showing some of the sites that have agroforestry within the EU, that a lot of these will be kind of demonstration, pilot or research sites. And they're used kind of as exemplars and examples. Now in Ireland, the same project, the AgForward project, came out with a figure of 224,000 hectares of agroforestry in Ireland. Now, that's 4.5% of the utilisable agricultural area. And I've mentioned this to a few people, and that has been very surprising to people. Well, it's very surprising because a lot of people have a very set idea of what agroforestry is. And their set idea of agroforestry doesn't include bocage, which is really what's the vast majority of that agroforestry that's been classified there by the AgForward would be bocage. And bocage is really kind of small fields with hedgerows and maybe small clumps of trees. And the fields in Ireland are relatively small, and there is a high amount of hedgerows within the landscape. So remote sensing would, and maybe even field studies would, classify much of Ireland as bocage. So it's interesting that this project came up with this large figure saying this is agroforestry, and yet a lot of people in Ireland wouldn't think of that as agroforestry, and maybe wouldn't even know exactly what agroforestry is. Nowadays, I think a lot of people in Ireland would consider agroforestry to be the type of agroforestry that is funded under the grant schemes. And the grant scheme is funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. It's funded by the National Exchequer rather than funded by EU funding. And it's part of the afforestation scheme. So the grant and premium category 11, GPC 11, which first started in 2014. And really the GPC 11 is kind of dipping a toe in the water. It's a first attempt and is to be reviewed and developed as time goes on. But under this scheme, over 6,000 euros per hectare is payable to an owner, and they don't have to be a farmer, categorized as a farmer. It can be just a landowner, and they can receive 6,220 euros per hectare for establishment of agroforestry. And then in addition to that is 5 years of annual premium payments, and those annual premium payments are 645 euros per hectare. Now, currently there's 78 live applications within going through this process at the moment, which consist of just over 300 hectares. 49 applications of those applications have received approval. That's about 150 hectares. 17 applications came in 2021, so last year, and 17 applications so far have been planted. And that amounts to just over 50 hectares. Plus there's another two sites that aren't funded under this scheme, but are funded for demonstration and pilot studies. And that's another 4 hectares. Now this the scheme, it does have certain rules, and this is where people kind of think of, or a lot of people think of, as being agroforestry. So it's 400 to 1,000 trees per hectare are planted as an initial stocking. Now over time those numbers will reduce as the trees get larger and as the trees get thinned out. But as the initial stocking on the day of planting, between 400 and 1,000 trees per hectare are planted. Those trees are then protected by 2 stakes and a 1.5 meter tree shelter. And the reason those are used is because there's sheep and young cattle can be then introduced to graze the pasture. But also, not just that, you can also take hay and silage from that site as well. Now, the The scheme itself does, I think, prefer native species, but it doesn't have to be native. And there is some leeway depending on site and owner objectives. And you can specify different species, and that's taken on a case-by-case basis by DAFM. There could be a maximum of 15% fruit and nut trees included within the scheme, within the project, Agroforestry project. But it's also noted that the planting will then come under the 2014 Forestry Act, which means that there would be trees on that site forever, that if there was to be a final harvest, the site then has to be replanted. There is an obligation to replant the site. Now, it may not be that the site is ever fully harvested. It could go into a continuous cover type system. Now, the new cap is coming up in the next couple of years, and the draft proposals for Ireland are quite interesting. Again, agroforestry has been mentioned a couple of times within this, so that's quite encouraging. Within the cap, there's going to be a performance-based approach is going to be adopted. So you get paid for kind of the impact that you have, I suppose. The afforestation is still going to be funded by the National Exchequer. So the GPC 11 will still be under the National Exchequer funding rather than the EU funding. And now there's a couple of things within the new cap, or the proposed new cap strategy that Ireland is going to take. One is within the agri-environment climate measure, that significant tree planting measures will be included, and they will include agroforestry and riparian planting. And that agroforestry will include planting in rows, planting as parkland, and planting as groups. It'll also include planting trees in riparian zones and for tree belts for ammonia capture within the farmyard. And then also woodland copses as well will be included within this. And then there's also an eco scheme being proposed, and there's 5 practices within that eco scheme, and one of those practices is the planting of native trees. And at the moment it's being proposed that you have to plant more than 3 trees per hectare per year that an owner is within this scheme, which doesn't sound a lot, but if those trees are put, say, in the hedgerows and then they're maintained, it could over time be fairly significant. But it should also be remembered as well that that the grants aren't everything, and they don't always influence landowner decision making the way that we would assume. Now, there is some work going on at the moment with this. I have a master's student along with UCD called Rachel Irwin, who is doing her master's looking at the barriers to barriers and perceptions of agroforestry from Irish dairy and dry stock farmers. And she's using the theory of planned behavior to study this. And a few preliminary results that are coming out from this. One is that they perceive the environmental benefits as the main advantage to trees on these farms. And then the second most common advantage that's been put forward by those farmers is the provision of shelter for livestock. There's another common perception of the negative impact of trees on pasture. So that's something that would need to highlight to people and to try and mitigate that kind of that perception. And then finally, that's coming out from this work that Rachel is doing, is that decision making isn't solely based on grants, and in fact, the grants can be a bit lower down in the priority list. So we need to be cognizant to progress agroforestry that that the grants are one thing, but we need to be able to show and demonstrate the benefits and how to mitigate and manage the negative impacts that could come from planting trees on farms. And hopefully Jim will be able to illustrate some of those positive impacts and some of the research that's been carried out, particularly in the north, on agroforestry in Ireland. And that's it for me. Thank you very much. I say I'm from the Teagasc Forestry Development Department. I'm also a member of the Irish Agroforestry Forum as well. And there's my contact details there if anybody would like to contact me. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Ian. If you can stop sharing your screen, we'll get Jim's presentation up. Jim had some minor technical issues just before we started, so I hope we're all good, Jim.
I hope so. Can you hear me okay, Tim?
We can hear you. So if you can put your screen up onto full presentation mode, Jim, and then introduce yourself and fire away.
Just 2 seconds. Hello, everyone. It's good to be speaking to you this evening, and happy to follow on from Ian, who's really given, I think, a fairly upbeat picture of where agroforestry is in Ireland. We think we're starting from a very low base, but we're really building well thanks to efforts of Eugene, Aaron, and Ian and others putting together the Irish Agroforestry Forum, which is now sort of acting as a support platform for people who are interested in Ireland. But what I really want to just talk about is Ian has given, talked a lot about the benefits of agroforestry and where we are in Ireland. I just want to sort of go back a stage and look at the research that's been done here and how that research has actually driven the interest in agroforestry and how it's underpinned the agroforestry programs we have now. As we know, there's a huge body of research into the theory and practice of agroforestry. And a lot of that, there's a fast growing body of research into agroforestry in temperate climates now. But really, we in Ireland were faced with a very small research base on both sides of the border relevant to or on the island of Ireland. And the research programme in Northern Ireland, which started in 1989, was really the first, if you like, agroforestry research on the island. And that's now happily gradually been extended across the island. So I really just want to present some of the results and some of the findings and some of the lessons we've learned from that early research and how that's been underpinned and built into the policy we have now. If we think that 30 years ago, really, when we started the agroforestry research, our main driver then was not really climate or anything. It was really to make grasslands in Northern Ireland more sustainable because we had the lowest tree cover in Europe, less than 7%. And we had an intensive grassland scenario. 95% of our agricultural land area was grassland, and that was being fairly intensively managed, and it was leading to the environmental problems you would associate with that. So as people know, the Farm Woodland Forum really came out of those early discussions across the UK when we looked at ways in which we could introduce trees into farmland to try and deal with primarily some of those issues of intensive grassland production and the low tree cover we were getting on farms. So a lot of investment went into establishing a replicated trial, which was replicated across the UK on 6 sites. Bangor, of course, as Tim is on, was one of those sites, as well as in England, down at Northwick, and in Wales, and the south of Wales, and in Scotland, we had 2 sites as well. The site we had at Loughgall, which is the only one really, I think, that's remaining intact in that the plot infrastructure is still there, was identical to those other sites in that we were comparing a grassland system, silvopastoral system, and woodland systems on the one within the one trial. And the strength of the whole trial was the fact that it was replicated across the 6 sites in the UK, and within each site itself we had 3 replicates of each treatment. So there was a lot of scientific backing behind the findings that we had. In our case, we just had started with a clean sheet, a clean green field pasture, which was sown with perennial ryegrass, and we established in that plots of, and we used sycamore was chosen as a common tree for all sites because it was the one tree that we thought would grow anywhere. but the sycamore didn't do so well. I think largely that was provenance issues, but on each site, people planted a tree, an iconic tree or a tree that would be suitable to their own landscape. And we also had duplicate plots with ash, which of course, sadly now are probably going to succumb. Although, I mean, we might raise it in discussion, we have noticed certainly that the ash trees in the silvopasture seem to be showing a much slower succumbing to dieback, and whether that's to do with the agroforestry treatment or not is yet to be proven. So we used ash as a sister tree to the sycamore, and we planted woodland ash and silvopasture. And that's just an overview of the site a few years ago. And you can see, even though the agroforestry is still probably about 75 to 80% sheep production, from the air, it looks like that's almost a complete tree canopy cover, yet there's enough light getting in to get significant grassland production. And you can see the distribution of the plots. So we established the trees into pasture, and right away from day one, those plots were grazed with sheep, because that was, once again, so we could take measurements, and we thought in those days protection against cattle just would be too expensive. We all used common protection and grazed to common protocols. And the first lesson we got was that you could establish trees in that scenario, and the trees grew well. They grew well in the tubes and with protection, and there was no real ill effects of any of the grassland. We were using sort of about 120 kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer on those trees. Now we don't, but we did in those days. And just a few shots through the whole history of the trial. So by the time the trees is established, but the bottom left really illustrates what I think we were trying to set out to do, because most of us involved in those early trials were really grassland people, were agronomists. We didn't have much experience of trees. The Forestry Commission did have an input in terms, and we appreciated that, but really most of the drivers were from a grassland platform. And the fact that we could actually manage this silvopastoral system as a normal grassland sward, for example, use the normal farm application operations, was really a selling point. And that was our aim, was to prove that we could see if we could sell this to farmers. And this is the type of sward system we have now, where we've got grass production under an ash tree, an ash plot, which started at 400 per hectare, and after two thinnings is now down to just over 200 to 210 trees per hectare at the minute. Of course, as time went on, the emphasis gradually changed through the 1990s and then into 2000s, and the whole emphasis on grassland production and grassland systems gradually moved to much more environmental and ecosystem services delivery. And we realized then that with the big switch of interest in carbon storage and the interest in sort of climate resilience, that if you looked across the range of ecosystem services that this silvopastoral system was delivering, it was really quite substantive. And we were, during the history of the trial, we were able to get a lot of information to back up all those data, information on biodiversity, information on flood control, on soil health, on soil percolation, on carbon storage. So all of those were, if you like, benefits that came not envisaged in the early stages of the trial, but gradually came as we went on. And just for an example, because we had our connection with Queen's University, we were able to get a lot of student projects on the project in the trial, and we demonstrated quite clearly that across a wide range of biodiversity, that agroforestry was really delivering very positive benefits, particularly in things like earthworms and pollinators. And just the data, the three graphs on the left show the agroforestry is the middle bar, the left is grassland, and the right is the woodland. So for spiders, birds, and beetles, from those master's projects, we were able to demonstrate clear benefits of agroforestry. But people already were knowing that the silvopasture can deliver these biodiversity benefits. So by really, after about sort of 22 years of the trial, there was the interest in carbon and what was happening with the whole carbon picture was starting to emerge. So my colleague, Dr. Rodrigo Odrave, who now runs the trial sites at Loughgall and has greatly expanded the range of research that's been done using that site, we managed to secure some funding to completely harvest, I think it was 8 complete trees, that's roots and everything, root, branch and twig, from the plot, from the treatments. And from those, we were able to get estimates of the standing biomass and the standing carbon content. And we got the total carbon in the woody biomass, this is of ash at about 200 per hectare, was about 77 tons of carbon was standing in those trees, and that had accumulated over 21 years. So if you like, it's an accumulation rate of about 3 tons of carbon per hectare per year, but obviously not uniformly over the whole life of the trial. Then we looked at the soil carbon, because obviously with the big interest in soil and soil health, and we found that there was more stable carbon, if you like. That was carbon that was bound to the very small microparticles in the soil, and that type of carbon is much more resilient and less likely to be lost than carbon that's bound to larger soil particles. And we found that in the silvopasture, deeper in the soil particularly, the carbon was better bound than in both the woodland and the grassland sites. So the carbon story was good from the point of view of the carbon that is accumulating in the wood, as well as what was happening below ground. And Rodrigo's estimates of carbon sequestration on the site from the silvopasture, the ash, component of a silvopasture is 2.4 tons carbon per hectare per year. A couple of years ago, that estimate was made, and you can add to that, of course, whatever the ryegrass would be sequestering over that time. Another key feature we found that as climate and climate resilience was coming to the top of the pile as an important factor, the extended grazing season that we were able to get under the silvopasture was really looking to be a key point. And if we looked at the soil moisture content, if we measured that over the winter period, we looked at it over 3 seasons, and we found an average of 15 weeks that you could keep livestock out on the plots, rather than compared to grassland only. And that was taking just a cut-off soil moisture content of 40%, which the soil scientists say is sort of anything above that, and you're really into a risk of poaching. But it was quite clear anyway that we could graze for far longer on the agroforestry trials than on the grassland. And with ammonia emissions being such a big issue, particularly looking at ways of trying to reduce ammonia, one of those ways is to try and simply keep animals out of housing as long as you can. And this ability to extend the grazing season by maybe 3 or 4 months which really could make a substantive impact on ammonia reduction. The other thing in terms of resilience to weather extremes was the fact that the silvopasture had increased soil permeability, and we were able to look right down through the soil profile. We looked we used a penetrometer, and or I forget the name of the piece of kit anyway, but I was able to look at soil resistance right down through the soil profile. And we went down to about 80 centimeters in the soil, and we found that as far as 76 centimeters down, within the agroforestry, the soil was significantly more permeable than where there was no trees at all in the soil. And that means that basically water is able to infiltrate down through that, and is able to cope better with floods and flash floods, the type that we're getting now. And it leads to drier soil, which reduces N2O emissions. And by keeping animals out of the houses, once again, has improved animal health and generally improved biological soil health. So the proven benefits from silvopasture that we could demonstrate from that site in Loughgall were an extended grazing season and being able to use grass, improve utilization of grass, and resilience to grazing, reduced ammonia emissions, increased biodiversity, more carbon sequestration, reduced water runoff. And of course, we had from 2 harvests of the trees, we were able to get a very valuable timber crop. From the first thinning, after 12 years, we were able to sell the ash for about €1,000 a hectare because it was sort of hurley stick or sports stick quality. And also we didn't do the research on this, but we knew from trials on other sites that the trees were able to actually remove phosphate from a greater volume of soil. And high levels of phosphate are a huge problem in a lot of our soils in Northern Ireland because of the intensive pig and poultry farming roundabout. There have been other trial sites as well. We had a sister upland site in the bottom right there at Brishain, County Antrim. There, the sycamore have continued to do well. That picture was just taken last summer. Those are 25 or 28-year-old sycamore with the hill cattle under them, and the farmer is able to outwinter animals under those still. And we had some other trials went on in various areas. The research challenges are, first of all, we know the system works. Technically, you can plant the trees, they can grow in that scenario, and you can deliver a range of ecosystem services. But the problem is really that evidence base is still largely from one site with one tree species, and we need to widen that scope. And I'm happy to say that, as Ian said, the Chagas in the south have taken that on board and are looking at increasing the range of sites and demonstration sites where detailed measurements will be able to taken to build that evidence base. And also we need more research on the relevance of silvopasture to cattle-based farms. And once again, that's going ahead, I'm pleased to say. And the whole question is, how can we better present agroforestry as a viable, sustainable, climate resilient system? And one of the things involved in that is, what are the factors limiting uptake? And as Ian was talking about Rachel Irwin's project and other projects, that's really now underway. The AFBI research programme, I said, although it was done in ash, and I'm not too despondent that the trees will eventually succumb to to ash dieback, because I think we've learned the valuable lessons from them. But as I said, they are actually seem to be fairly, whether they're resilient or whether just the fact that the animals are eating the leaves as they fall in the autumn, and that's maybe helping just to slow down the reinfection by ash dieback from the foliage on the ground. We don't know. There's a research project underway on that at the minute, and Rodrigo has a lot of other research going on, important research on, particularly on the soil side of things, what's happening below the ground in the silvopasture. So really, I think we're positive about where we're going. We're getting valuable projects going on like Rachel's, and just last year we've put together the Irish Agroforestry Forum, which is and we initially received a tremendous boost by being able to secure a grant from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in the south, in Southern Ireland, under its Woodland Supports Project scheme. And that's been a real benefit because we've been able to appoint a project officer, Maureen Kilgore, and we've been able to run some farm visits, on-farm visits already, and we've made some videos and on-farm videos of agroforestry, focusing very much on practice, on best practice from the site of the type of sites that Ian was talking about that are being planted under the grant scheme in the south, but also people who are just simply experimenting and trying things, not necessarily under grant conditions. So overall, we feel that we have a good platform to work from. The forum, the Irish Agroforestry Forum, is very much tied in, of course, with the Farm Woodland Forum, because we have really the same objectives at the end of the day, and synergy and making use of our expertise and importation is very important. So thank you very much, everyone, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. If I can quickly get you to stop. Yep, you've done it straight away. And we'll just before you, if you have any questions for either Ian or Jim, if you can put them in the chat right now, that's great. And we'll quick ahead across the RSC to Jim O'Neill in England, who will update us on the situation there. Jim, if you want to share your screen, and I'll hand over to you.
I will do. When I just sort out my view, just bear with me. Got a full gallery option going.
We can see everything all right. If you make it full presentation mode, you're good.
How does that look?
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Nice to meet you all, everyone online. Two really fascinating talks now. I'm following on with a little bit of dry sort of topic, but it'll be very brief. I just wanted to make sure that you were updated on the position of agroforestry in England at this point in time. My role is the agroforestry advisor for England. Only just started in January, so it's a new role. Luckily, at the same time, Natural England has appointed an agroforestry lead as well, and we're working sort of very closely together on sort of building relationships, and I'm working together with DEFRA on building some of the future grant systems. So I'll just cover a couple of the elements of grants that are available at this point in time, and just go on to describe what is coming down the tracks for agroforestry in the near future. So one thing, I mean, my perspective on trees on farms, trees, woodland, and forestry, you know, extend from individual hedgerow trees right the way through to farm woodlands. And one of the aspects at the upper end of the scale is the farm woodlands opportunity under the Woodland Creation Planning Grant. Obviously, we're working in England, so it must be in England. The minimum total is 5 hectares, which allows a parcel size of ½ hectare. So you're really getting down to farm woodland scale levels of copses and woodlands now, and you can have basically a planning grant, which is a minimum of £1,500 to develop a plan for those woodlands. It sort of risks the element of planning to find out whether a woodland is viable on your property or not. So that's just one end of the scale. It's not perhaps the traditional way we think of agroforestry. We think of it a bit more interactive. So under the England Woodland Creation Offer, which is the current Forestry Commission England grant, there are agroforestry opportunities within that, and they are for shelter belts and riparian buffers. There are only 2 elements of it at this point in time, but there is a view to looking into more detail about how we can be some of the more inclusive sort of agroforestry, arable, silvopasture systems can be funded. But at this point in time, we've got a minimum total of 1 hectare on any given property, and a minimum parcel size of 0.1 of a hectare, and a minimum width of 10 meters. Now, the minimum widths in UCO, in the Woodland Creation Offer, is normally 20 meters, but in recognition of sort of agroforestry, shelter belts and riparian buffers, it's allowed to go down to 10 meters at this point in time. The other end of the spectrum, if you like, and from Natural England, the only other option viable at this point in time that you might consider as agroforestry on the spectrum of that is the wood pasture creation under the countryside stewardship, which can be very extensive, but that's just the other end of the spectrum that's available at the moment. So I'll just go on briefly to talk about the things that are developing at the moment, developing within DEFRA, and myself and Jeff Newman, the agroforestry lead for Natural England, both sitting on the groups with DEFRA with regard to how these are brought along. And the Sustainable Farming Incentive is going to have an agroforestry standard. Then there'll be the local nature recovery, and then landscape recovery. They're the 3 tiers of grants for the future within the environmental land management system. So a little bit of detail. So The agroforestry standard, it's being developed in co-design, as all ELM projects are, developing with stakeholders and farmers. And the initial lines of thinking are they're going to be an entry-level option. It's meant to be sort of very broad, covering a very broad spectrum to bring in a large number of applicants. So it's meant to be very, very straightforward. It's not going to be advisor-led, it's going to be applicant-led, and there'll be a number of standards to hit. And there'll be guidance and webinars and that sort of thing for training, but it's not meant to be really detailed and really complex. It's meant to be fairly straightforward, fairly simple. There will be capital elements for that establishment of agroforestry, be it silvo arable, silvo pasture. And then there'll be an annual maintenance period to year 15, followed by a management payment beyond that. There is discussion at the moment about making sure we have the facility to bring in existing agroforestry systems into some sort of payment option to make sure that we aren't disincentivizing people who are already a bit forward thinking, have got something on the go already. And then we're looking at trialing with the existing pilot customers in the DEFRA sort of trial periods. We're thinking of trialing some of the agroforestry standard options with them this year, towards the end of this year. And then possibly some new target customers might be involved in 2023 with the eventual intention of launching the agroforestry standard in 24. But I must stress that all this could change. It is very much dependent on the farmers and stakeholders involved. And how the sort of initial thinking and options might be received, and what, whether it survives that first point, that first contact, if you like. So we need to make sure we're working together. I can tell you it's quite an intensive process, and I'm sure some of you on the call are involved with this as well. So quite interesting, and I personally feel, going onto this page, that the more adventurous agroforestry systems are going to logically sit within the local nature recovery element of grant, and that allows for more complex thinking, for some advisory element to creep in and make sure that you're working to tailor fit your agroforestry system to your particular situation, conditions, farm, land, weather, climate, whatever it might be. And also, if you have a land with more constraints on it, it's probably going to be much more fitting to go through the LNR process. And lastly is the landscape recovery. I don't think we need to worry too much about this yet, because it's reasonably specialised in that it's meant to be a landscape scale sort of land use change option, which is going to be based over 500 hectares. So it could be one owner. There aren't too many of those around, perhaps, who are willing to put that in. But it could be a multiple, a collaboration, a cooperative of farms and landowners who might want to go down that route. And agroforestry is definitely going to be part of that picture, because it will be multi-spectrum right across the board. So that is really a very, very quick run through. It's very much in development, but I can tell you for nothing that people are working very hard on this to make sure that they're hitting targets. It's a bit disappointing we haven't got too much available at this point in time. One question that I am asking of the England Woodland Creation Offer team is, we can go down to 400 a hectare within the forestry side of the UCO. And I'm starting to ask questions, is there an opportunity for us to have a short-term option of the 400 per hectare option for perhaps silvo pasture within that? And yet to get some full answers. I'm guessing it won't be overly attractive, because the options for individual protection won't be particularly attractive. But some people might still want to take it up. So watch this space, and we'll see if we can get something to plug that gap between now and 2024. So that's it. That's grand for now. So I shall stop sharing, and I shall pass back over to our chair.
Okay. Brilliant. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody. Actually, those were really, really interesting overviews of things happening in both countries, both historically and bringing us to the present day. There has been some fast and furious action in the chat. So questions are coming and going quickly. There are a few that haven't been answered. And if anybody is feeling particularly excitable and wants to bring your mics off mute, just raise your hand and we can see if we can ask a question directly. While we're waiting to see if anybody is brave enough to do that, we do have a question that hasn't been answered yet in the chat, as far as I can tell, from Christian, which was basically just a question around consumer demand for sustainable products and the creation of a specific market for agroforestry products, similar to organics. Would that help to drive the uptake of agroforestry? So looking at added value, I guess, on agroforestry products. Is that something that anybody in either country has been looking at?
Tim, it's not something that has really been looked at as such, but I know there is increasing interest in agroforestry in Ireland, and particularly in kind of the border counties, for the poultry industry, because it's being viewed as a way of having the kind of the free range chickens. And was it Sainsbury's a number of years back had they marketed eggs that were from chickens that were free ranging within trees, and so there is interest from some of the producers, if you like. Whether that's going to translate to greater demand from consumers is another matter, but I presume the producers wouldn't be looking to do this unless they had a very good reason to, and that reason surely is that consumers are asking for it.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah, one of our largest egg producers in the north of Ireland, Skye Eggs, they market all their eggs now as Woodland eggs, coming from on the box, you know, with trees and hens. It's coming from hens in systems where they are in some way exposed to trees. I don't know how that's verified, but they're certainly marketing that, you know, as a brand leader.
Great. I'll move us on because we've got 5 minutes and we're going to get through as many of these as we can. This is an Irish question. If the land is rented, can the tenant farmer still claim their entitlements if the land is put into agroforestry? That's from John.
I'm not sure about that. So I don't want to say yes or no either way. But if that person wants to send me details, I can pass it on to one of our advisors within the forestry department, and they'd be able to more categorically give an answer one way or the other.
Tim, could I jump in here from an English perspective? That Tenant Farmers Association are heavily involved in the discussions about agroforestry and, well, all aspects of forestry, and they are, you know, this is a topic of interest. I can't tell you the answer, but the intention is to try as much as we can to make sure that tenant farmers can apply for these grants without any detriment to their grant receiving, if you like. But we're probably some way off a full agreement at this point.
Okay, we've had, there've been a couple of other points made around tenancy in the chat, sort of agreeing that it's an important issue for us to address. I'm just speed reading through the chat, so forgive me if I miss somebody. Do you think the focus on improving air quality will help agroforestry be taken up by more farmers? That was from Fiona.
I think that the ammonia issue is a huge issue in Ireland because of intensive livestock production. And the agroforestry option is attractive. It won't be the sole answer because you're dealing with a huge problem with slurry and stuff. But certainly, if you could, build in a resilient system that could decrease your ammonia emissions by up to 25%, and whether or more, and whether by planting more trees around animal houses. And some of the research that AFBI are doing at the minute is showing that, you know, trees do absorb nitrogen, some of the nitrogen that's coming out of and the ammonia that's coming out of those houses. I think, yeah, agroforestry has a part to play, and we should sell that.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I think we've almost reached the end of the questions that I can see.
Sorry, Tim.
Sorry, Ian.
Just going back to the emissions, there is some work going on within DAFM at the moment, looking at having some form of grant scheme that would allow for the planting of trees specifically for mitigation of ammonia. And that comes under from one of the context slides I had, where they were saying about planting for ammonium emissions mitigation. So it looks like that's likely to go ahead anyway. There's been more work done in the background on that by DAFM.
Okay, stay with me, Ian. Why is there a 15% limit on fruit and nut trees in ROI applications?
That's a good question, and it's a question that I don't really have an answer to. Whilst I did have some input, and so did Jim, into the formulation of the scheme, it's not something that I would have put in there. I wouldn't have put that limitation myself, because I suppose that the scheme, because it comes from the Forest Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, was looking more towards timber. Now, in agroforestry, a product doesn't necessarily have to be timber. It could be fruit, it could be nuts, it could be lots of other things coming from the trees, including fodder and medicinals and that kind of thing. So, you know, like I said, the grant, the GBC 11, was the first dip in the water of the toe. And maybe in time with reviews, that 15% may change. I don't know, but I think that's probably why, because the focus was more on timber producing species, mainly because it was coming from the Forest Service side of the house. I think if the grant was coming from agriculture, there'd be maybe a different focus on it, and that is starting to happen now, because there is a lot more talk between forestry colleagues and agriculture colleagues within DAFM that there hadn't been previously. And there is a lot of talk about agroforestry from all sorts of areas within the Department of Agriculture now that previously there hadn't been. So it's quite buoyant at the moment, and it's quite positive, and it seems to be moving quite fast as well. So watch this space, and maybe things will change in the next 2 or 3 years. We'll see.
Okay, well, we're at the very end, but we do have a final sort of, well, there are a couple of questions coming through. The chat's becoming more and more bubbly as we get to the very end. But I'd quite like a controversial question to finish on. It looks like agroforestry might have some scope for future carbon trading markets and companies looking to offset. Is this looking to be something that will aid uptake?
That's a big picture. It's bigger than just agroforestry. The idea who owns the carbon from under agriculture schemes. And I think farmers would be very loath to lose any carbon that they gain in their schemes, and to hand that over would be detrimental. My personal view, but others, you know, might have other views on that. It's a much wider picture, and the whole issue of who owns the carbon that's stored. That's go ahead.
Okay, we are at time, I'm afraid. So what I will say is that we do record these sessions, and we will put up the links to the recording on the Farm Woodland Forum website. We're very happy to carry on this discussion on the JISC mail. So please join us there and continue this conversation with us. There were there are a couple of good links as usual in the chat if you haven't seen them. But of course, we really want to highlight the Irish Agroforestry Forum now as well, and welcome any farmers from Ireland who've joined us this evening, and please make sure you make use of that resource now that we are up and running. We will be sort of jointly running the JISC mail, so we can hear from everybody. So I hope we can have carry on having good and fruitful conversations. And I noticed Andrew was just quickly highlighting the fact that the Orchard Network has got a National Orchard Blossom Day on the 29th of April, which is linked to the EU Orchard Blossom Day. And the main aim is to provide an opening for the wider public of interest is a crossover with agroforestry. So just something else to put in your calendars while we're here. And I will bring this session to a close, but quickly by thanking Jim, Ian, and Jim for providing us with, I think, a set of really stimulating talks this evening, which I hope you've all found useful. And certainly the chat seemed to indicate that it was helpful. And as usual, I'd like to thank John and Sally, who've been working in the background to set this all up for us. And please follow us on Twitter and keep the conversation going. And we'll call it to a close there. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.